Welcome to Hill to Hill for our Kenyon Alumni Elections panel. I hope everyone's holiday season was joyous. To those Kenyon students and faculty joining us, I hope you're enjoying the last week of the winter break. On Monday, we are back in session for what we expect to be a great spring semester. My name is Joe Klesner. I serve as the director of the Center for the Study of American Democracy at Kenyon, and I teach in the Department of Political Science. The center is a nonpartisan organization within the college seeking to educate our students and community members, including the broader community of alumni, parents, and friends, about democracy and contemporary public affairs. I especially welcome tonight three Kenyon alumni who have generously agreed to share their views about contemporary American politics with all of us, and I'm eager to hear what they have to say. First, our moderator is Sarah Longwell, class of 2002. Sarah is the president and CEO of Longwell Partners in Washington, D.C. She is a co-founder of the organization Defending Democracy Together and executive director of the Republican Accountability Project. She is also publisher of The Bulwark. Many of you have doubtless seen or heard Sarah interviewed on national television, radio, and podcasts, as she has helped us all better understand the contentious political climate we live in now. Second, George Cook, class of 1999, currently serves as Senior Director for State Government Relations at the Kellogg Company. George has been active in state-level politics and public policy in both Michigan and his native Ohio, both as an aide to legislators and a representative of the private sector, including a long stint working in government affairs for Toyota. More recently, George served as Director of Legislative Affairs for Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. Our final panelist is James Caesar, class of 1967, the Harry F. Byrd Professor of Politics at the University of Virginia. One of our nation's foremost academic experts on American politics, Jim's notable books include Liberal Democracy and Political Science, Reconstructing America, and Nature and History in American Political Development, as well as several books covering individual elections earlier in the 2000s. Jim serves on foundation boards and has made frequent media appearances to comment on American politics. He was awarded an honorary degree by Kenyon in 2002. We conceptualized this panel as an opportunity for these alumni experts to reflect on where our nation stands after the midterm elections of 2022. So while they will comment on the election results, they will also look forward to the coming term of Congress, the challenges of governing with a divided Congress, developments we're likely to see at the state level to counter the inability of Washington to come up with policy responses to current challenges, and how all of this may shape the upcoming presidential election in 2024. Led by our moderator, Sarah, the panelists will discuss these themes for about 40 minutes before turning to your questions. As a reminder, you're all on mute to enhance the audio. Also, to avoid distractions during their conversation, the panelists have turned off their chat. So please direct your questions to me, and you'll see that I am Joseph Klesner. When we get to the Q&A portion of the event, I will pose as many of those questions to the panel as we can cover during the remaining hour. Let me now turn the podium, such as it is, over to Sarah and our panel.
Hey, thanks for having me. Everybody hear me okay? Thumbs up. All right. I love being with Kenyon people. And I'm super excited to talk politics with Kenyon people. So here's how we're going to do tonight. 40 minutes isn't that much time to make sense of current American politics. So I'm going to structure it kind of fast, but we're going to do past, present, future. And so we're going to start with the past, and I'm going to start with you, George. So 2022 just happened. And I'll leave it to you to decide whether or not Republicans underperformed or whether they met expectations, or how you feel about it. But I want to know, a lot of people have been trying to sort of understand why the results didn't go the way everybody thought, right? I mean, people thought red wave. That's not what happened. And so people kind of have different theories. Was it because voters actually cared about democracy? Was it because abortion was actually a game changer? Was it because of the candidate quality on the Republican side and some of the key races? Like, tell me how you make sense of what happened in 2022.
Well, Sarah, thank you very much for the question, and everybody, thank you for participating. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here today and to participate in this conversation. So I would start off by saying and using a term that I'm so unbelievably sick of hearing, and that is the red wave that did not occur. If I never hear that term again, it will be way too soon. But I think, we basically characterized this election by saying we expected a red wave. That didn't happen. It looks like there was roughly about an 8-seat gain for Republicans in this midterm election. And to put that into some type of historical perspective, the only presidents, and this is Biden I'm speaking about, who lost fewer congressional seats since FDR in a midterm election were Roosevelt in 34, Kennedy in 62, George H.W. Bush in 1990, Clinton in 98, and George W. Bush in 2022. So you're looking at, from a historical perspective, most presidents in their first term, especially in that midterm, lose a ton of seats. And so I think there was a lot of discussion coming up to this election, expecting President Biden and the Democrats to lose a lot of seats for a lot of reasons. A lot of economic uncertainty, gas prices were high. People are still concerned about COVID and the reaction to that. And so that didn't materialize. It ended up only being an 8-seat total majority. The Senate, Democrats actually picked up a seat. That was, again, until Senator Sinema decided to become an independent. But she'll still most likely, caucus mainly with Democrats. So they're still in a good position there. So I would say most people would characterize this as a general loss for Republicans. Now, why did that occur? I think that there are many, many reasons. And the first one I'll point to is specifically, I think people are looking at the Republican Party now, and it looks like it's a party in a bit of a state of dysfunction. And you have these two major camps battling it out. You have the Trump MAGA side of the party, which I think many people look at and say kind of an extremist group of folks. When you look at some of the candidates that were put forward and characterize them and their politics, you have J.D. Vance in Ohio. You had Anna Paulina Luna from the Florida 13th Congressional District, who ran self-avowedly as a pro-life extremist. Folks like Mike Collins, who ran in a safe seat in Georgia, who was seen in Twitter carrying an assault rifle and falsely claiming that President Trump won the state in 2020. John Brechin, former state legislator in Oklahoma. Jim Jordan ran a commercial supporting him. And, he was seen as a pretty extremist candidate as well. And I don't even want to talk about George Santos in New York. That whole thing is a big mess. And that was more after the fact that, but I think it's just very reflective, I think, where the Republican Party is. So you have extremist candidates who won primary elections mainly, who then went to the general election. And then the general electorate did not support those extreme candidates. And I think that was a big thing. On the other side as well, you have specific policies that I think people were relatively concerned about. And the major one, of course, was choice, Roe versus Wade. And so I think you saw in states where people were actually concerned that choice might be in jeopardy, states like Michigan that went all down, I think Democrats fared very, very well. But a state like New York, which is traditionally a Democratic state, Republicans made good strides there. But no one in the state of New York thinks that choice will ever be taken away in New York. So I think there were people felt like things were, status quo and relatively okay. Republicans said, all right, but the rest of the country, where choice, I think, was a major issue. I think people came out and in droves supported the candidates and the party, specifically Democrats, that would have been seen as preservers of choice.
One of the things I do a lot of is I do focus groups with voters all the time. And so going into the 22 elections, I was talking to swing voters constantly. And Jim, one of the things that I heard from swing voters is they really wanted to vote for Republicans. They were mad. They were not that happy with Joe Biden. They were not that they were unhappy about inflation, about supply chains. There was actually, an appetite for the opportunity to have divided government, to have a check on Biden. And yet, when it came to the individual candidates, you say, okay, well, you're going to vote for Blake Masters or Mark Kelly. People would be like, oh, I'm not voting for Blake Masters. That guy's crazy. And so, despite the favorable, I think that sometimes Democrats want to say, well, it's because of our policies and people are really for them. I'm not positive I'd buy that in 22. I think something else might have been going on there. But what do you make of 22? And despite all the fundamentals sort of being in favor of Republicans, why didn't they do better this midterm?
Well, one thing is we may have had wrong expectations. And if we'd known what was actually happening, we would never have said there would be a red wave. The polling situation that we have now is execrable. It just doesn't work. That's the truth of the matter. The polls, the way they poll, the manner in which they poll is something of the past. It used to be people would call and someone would be at home to answer the telephone. This isn't the case now. They're doing it through computers and whatnot. It's pretty much a broken system. So people started talking about this and that this would be a Republican wave. Many people talked about it, but I believe it was never the case. In fact, this was close from the beginning, and it may have been contrary to what people thought or expected, but it wasn't contrary to what they were actually, the way they were going to actually vote. And that, I think, we saw the reality appear, and it was a great disappointment for Republicans. And to people who looked at the objective situation in the country and saw all the factors that they thought were leaning in the direction of Republicans, but it wasn't enough to change people's actual minds. And so the Republicans did get a majority in the House. They picked up enough seats. They had more votes in the House than the Democrats by about 51 to 47, but they expected a 30-seat majority. Some said more than that would be expected. It just didn't happen. And I think it's because we misjudged the expectations.
So I'm just going to push on that just a little bit because, you know, it's not unreasonable. The fundamentals. So for me, I was listening to these voters all the time talk about how they didn't want to vote for these individual candidates, didn't want to vote for Oz, didn't want to vote for Doug Mastriano. They found the individual, candidates really extreme, but like they were unhappy with the environment. I mean, I think it had much more to do with swing voters because, one thing that Democrats sort of said is they were like, originally there was a lot of talk about young turnout being big or that there was turnout around abortion. As more numbers have come in, that hasn't really been true. It is actually that swing voters, right? Republicans had an edge in terms of turnout, right? Like the polls actually were sort of right in their R+2, R+3 overall judgment. There were more Republicans, just a lot of people who identify as Republicans in these swing states and these key races voted for Democrats because they were sort of rejecting individual candidates. And so as somebody who I know, a lot historically, it should have looked like a Republican year, but what do you think's happening with the Republican Party that swing voters find themselves sort of now in 18 and 20, less so in 20 actually, because down ballot people sort of outperform Trump. But now again in 22, there seems to be sort of swing voters taking a pass, at least a percentage of them, a meaningful percentage of them taking a pass on the Republican Party right now. Do you think it's there are policy reasons? Is it abortion? Is it because the election denialism isn't that interesting to people? What do you think's going on with the party that independents are pushing back, even with inflation and all the other factors being there?
Well, there are always bad candidates running in every election if you look at it. And both parties have bad candidates, including the Democrats. Look at how many Democrats are on the left extreme, way beyond what we'd expect from the middle of American politics. So they had their bad candidates as well. I don't think you could say, for example, that Dr. Oz was an extremist. There were some extremists, but by and large, it was a reasonable series of candidates that was presented. So I go back to the view is that we didn't measure where the electorate actually happened to be. That may be a sad choice. When you look at the objective factors, it sure seems to me, and I thought this would be the case as well. When I looked at the polls, I thought it would be very close. But when I looked at the discussion of the issues, there's no doubt that the Democrats, in my view, had performed very poorly. They have a poor president, or so many could say. They had a president who's not on top of his game. They had the situation in Afghanistan, which inaugurated a horrible stand in foreign affairs. They had a high rate inflation, which was said to be going away, but wasn't. And you can go down the line with migrants, law and order, all these factors, which would have seemed to mitigate in favor of the Republicans, it just didn't happen when people actually made their decisions.
Yeah, but that's sort of my point. All that stuff working in their favor, and people still didn't want to vote for them. But you know, George, to go back to you on something, because I'm going to push on you too. The places where Republicans picked up the seats that ultimately made their margins are in places where Democrats normally fare pretty good. California, New York. And there's a lot of people who think that that is because those states are like really governed by Democrats and all Democrats all the time. And that even in a year where abortion's such a big issue in these bluer areas, people were looking for a correction against sort of the Democratic forces that are running these states. And so where I think Democrats did really well were in like these swing states like Arizona, in Michigan. I mean, your former boss like crushed by 10 points. But what do you make of the bluer states? Does that feel like a rejection of sort of Democratic trifectas?
You know, I think when you look at politics as a whole on the state level, I don't know that it's the trifecta issue. I mean, when you look at the state level, right now, there are many states that have trifectas in the state governments, right? 22 states have Republican trifectas, 16 have Democrat trifectas. And we're seeing that on the state level, specifically governors, Senate, and the houses and the state levels, they're becoming, very, I think, polarized, right? So when you're looking at it on that local level, it's not really a rejection of trifectas and that one party rule. You're seeing it in states, and it's increasing actually. When you look at the federal level, though, look, again, first-term president, midterm elections, there's always usually a response across the nation. And that's why those presidents tend to lose a lot of seats. And so it's a natural reaction. And I think, again, to my earlier point, in a state like a California, in a state like New York, and specifically in a state where people didn't have concerns that by supporting specific candidates, you were going to be supporting really extreme views that were going to push you over the top and make, your state or the country a very, I think, again, extreme place, people were able and felt comfortable voting for Republicans. People felt comfortable in New York doing so. People felt comfortable in California doing so. Again, in the state of California, the right to abortion is never going to go away. In a state like New York, the right to abortion is never going to go away. In a state like California, I don't think anybody feels like they're going to be taken over by MAGA super right-wing conservative candidates, and the state's going to go in that direction. Same thing as in New York, right? So where you felt like if you made a choice, you were making a choice for a moderate candidate and adding to the moderation of this country, then you felt comfortable supporting those. And that's, again, I do think a very natural reaction in the election cycle, right? We've always had that. And so I think that's what gave Republicans the ability to have those gains in those areas. If there were more concerns, I think people would have voted differently.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think what everybody's saying, and I think this is, if you had to boil it down, there was a rejection of extremes in this last election, which, considering where we've been for the last 7 years, I think felt like maybe a little bit of a green shoot. But then we get to governing, right? So let's talk about the present. So we just got through this speaker fight, which, if people are watching it, was wild. It's the best season of C-SPAN I've ever watched. And so what is next for Kevin? He got the gavel, took him the 15th time's the charm. And look, I don't think democracy has to be like neat and tidy. I think it's fine that it's messy and that there was a fight and that people are, the Republican Party's trying to figure out who it is. But now they got to govern, and they got to govern with a mirror image slim majority of the Democrats, but their faction's pretty, like, they're different, like the gradations within the Republican Party. I think, and it's similar in the Democrats, but somehow Nancy Pelosi was able to get those guys to march in a lot, seemingly more lockstep. Jim, what do you think is going to happen with Kevin McCarthy? Is he going to be able to hold this caucus together when you get to big fights like raising the debt limit, funding Ukraine, and even if you can go a step deeper than that around the culture, like what's happening with the Republican Party right now?
Well, turn to the Democrats for a second before we get to the Republicans. There too, you have extremes. It's just that the party has gone to the extreme side and brought the rest of the people around it. The whole election since the last election has shown that the Democratic Party has moved far to the left and has adopted the policies of the far left, almost to a T. And that was the great surprise of the American people, who thought in Joe Biden they were going to get a moderate president. They haven't. So the Democratic Party is, as it were, moved to the left. And the surprising thing is that in a party in which so many of the people elected to the House on the Democratic side have sympathies with the middle, they refused to keep their positions in the middle and always gave way to the left, with very few exceptions. It's a kind of amazing result that the left was able to carry issue after issue after issue. And yet, when you looked at the whole mass of the Democratic Party, you said, all these peoples are not where AOC is. And yet she was calling the shots. So it's a different situation in the Republican Party. You have people who have different views on a smaller amount, but different views on different issues. And those are now, for the time being, showing up in differences between the parties. It's a different situation in each party.
Yeah, but I mean, was AOC calling the shots? I mean, I would say Joe Manchin was calling the shots, right?
Not
like it
at
was
all.
and Kirsten Sinema, like it was the moderates on the Democratic side that refused to, they were basically forcing them to scale back these incredibly large spending bills, right? Like BBB got paired back, the infrastructure bill got pulled way down. They never got their voting bill passed. And a lot of that was Manchin and Sinema, no?
In the end, Manchin and Sinema gave in on the major pieces of legislation. And before
But after
that,
they'd been changed, right? After they'd been knocked down.
well, they gave in. They didn't stand up and resist. And it was a surprise when Manchin changed. But there he is on the left with people on the left. There was some moderation in the amount of money spent, but still, why didn't he vote against the bill? That's what you might have expected. He didn't. He's probably sad about it now. Sinema may have changed their mind, but at the time, they went along with the rest of the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party is a straight out party of the left for the last period of time, in which the left has dominated and the president has gone along with them. That's the other point. They had the president backing all of these policies, and those were the policies that prevailed.
Well, just on the Republican side, though, just like going to the governing question. So just real quickly, can Kevin McCarthy hold this caucus together?
Well, we'll have to see what happens. I have no knowledge of exactly what's going to happen. It's a very slim majority. He doesn't now have the rules working in his favor as Nancy Pelosi does. So there's more of a chance, obviously, that there could be problems, but we'll have to see what happens. Most of the issue on the Democratic side will not be with voting on specific policies. It's going to be with other measures. It's going to be testing the Democrats, looking over what they're doing, bringing them in for reviews. And that's going to be the main agenda of the Republicans.
So, George, I would say that what was interesting to me about the speaker fight and the fact that in the rules, they basically came down to any member is going to be able to do this, what they call this motion to vacate, which means they can like kick McCarthy out if he behaves in ways they don't like. And it seems like the main thing they didn't want to see out of him, that they wanted to be able to control him on, was that he didn't work with Democrats. Like they do not want to see him make compromises, right? That's where all the rhino stuff comes in. Mm-hmm. Do you see an opportunity for the parties to work together? You know, sometimes I talk about this thing called the shadow Congress, where everybody's sort of performative about how we won't work together, but then they kind of do behind the scenes because they still have to govern. Do you have hope that there is an opportunity for a shadow Congress, or is the way that things are set up now and McCarthy being such a weak speaker make it impossible for Democrats and Republicans to work together?
Yeah. Before I answer that question, I do want to just say one thing really quickly, kind of a rebuttal to Jim's comments, who I respect very much, and I see where that's coming from. I will say this: I feel that Republicans do a much better job in general in discussing the issues of the day, of saying, you know, your question was, what are the problems with the Republican Party? And Jim very quickly pivoted and said, well, the Democrats are super liberal and they're a big problem. And that was, you know, the bulk of the answer there. I would reject the concept that the Democrats are an unbelievably leftist party. Yeah, you have your AOCs. Yes, you have your leftists. And I mean, I understand that, right? Like both parties have extremists. And the truth of the matter, I think the extremists on both sides really kind of help keep the spirit of the party, at least in small groups, right, going. The real problem with American democracy right now is that it's a two-party system, right? Like that's not a great thing. But the only thing worse than a two-party system is a one-party system. And right now, it seems like we're a one-party system because the Republican Party is so hamstrung and paralyzed by infighting. And I don't want to see that. I think most people who are actually big fans of democracy and want to see democracy succeed want to see a strong Republican Party. And right now, I don't know that we're seeing that. So I would reject the concept and idea that Biden is an uber liberal and that the Democratic Party as a whole on the national scene is very, very liberal. I think in general, to your point, I think Manchin, I think Sinema, I think others helped really drive that conversation and brought it into the middle. And I think where we do see successes in politics in general is when things get back to the middle, because in total, the country is relatively conservative. As a people, we don't like to see massive changes, right? We don't want to go from one extreme to the other. And that's why you have the reactions in midterm elections that you have. I think when you see that, one party does really well, specifically in the president, because it's the most visible thing, I think people say, okay, we have these concepts. But to get us back to a sense where we're not going to be swinging left and right and getting in this pendulum thing, in our next opportunity, we're going to elect more people from the other party. And that keeps us more in the middle. And it makes us have those conversations in total over time. And that's how we self-correct and course correct as a people in the state of politics. So that's my reaction to that. What I will say is this, in terms of the opportunities for there to be coordination, yes, Sarah, I do agree. I think in general, in politics, you have people who come out and when you're in front of the cameras, when you're talking to the press, you have to give your talking points and you say all of these different things and you start the fights, whatever. But there are always, in Michigan's legislature, I saw it working with the governor as a director of legislative affairs. My job was to help to get the governor to get her agenda passed. And in order to do that, I had to work closely in Michigan while I was in that seat with Republicans because Republicans controlled the Senate and the House. So they had things that they wanted and the governor has to sign off on all of those bills. So they can't get the things that they want unless the governor signs the bill. The governor can't get the things that she wanted unless the legislature was on board. So you had folks who were more moderate who would come in and they would be the people who came in, did the shadow government thing, worked together to get things done, go back to their parties and find out the things that they needed and really wanted in order to come to the table and negotiate. But I do think it's going to be a tough row to hoe for Speaker McCarthy. It just is. To your point, 15 votes to get elected Speaker, giving the authority to the body for one person to vote to remove him as Speaker, that's going to be really tough. How do you make everybody happy in that situation? Again, within your own party. If he tries to do things that's going to make it look like he's working with Democrats, there are going to be moderate Republicans who are like, yes, good job, way to do that. And then there are going to be, again, those far right people who don't want to see any type of deals made or any type of functional government actually happen. You have people in office right now, again, a lot of these MAGA far right candidates who don't believe government is a good thing. They ran anti-government. They ran to get a job when they hate the job, as it has been reflected through the course of history. So, it's going to be difficult for McCarthy. I think it's going to be problematic. The Dems, on the other hand, are going to try to do everything that they can to highlight and shine a light on this dysfunction that's going on in Congress. If they're smart, they're going to just sit back and shut up. Somebody once said, when your enemy is doing something to hurt themselves, don't do anything to stop that.
Yeah, don't interrupt them. Yeah, right.
Go ahead and shoot yourself in the foot if that's what you want to do. So Democrats, if they're smart, are going to sit back and allow this all to unfold and see what happens. And I think that it's going to be really difficult for things to get done in Congress.
So, I think that people sort of generally have this sense that federal politics is not going so great, and is a bit of a mess. And it used to be that what people would do, they would say like, well, things in Washington are crazy, but all politics is local. Everything happens at the local level, and that's where the magic happens, laboratories of democracy. And yet one of the sort of real negative trends we've seen, whether it's the rise of social media, the destruction of local newspapers, whatever it is, there's this nationalization of politics now. And in fact, Jim, you're there in Virginia, Youngkin's election seemed to be, it was an off year, and it seemed to be a direct repudiation of Biden, right? It seemed connected to people wanting a correction on that, as well as sort of a response to things like inflation and grocery store prices. But do you see local politics still being the solution? Like, you're both, George, you're a Michigan guy, you worked for a governor. Is the hope still local politics, or is local politics being too corrupted by national politics?
I'd say more than ever, local politics is becoming important. Look at the country today. Masses of people are moving like we've never seen before. How many people have left California? The choice of where to live is the first thing that federalism offers. If you don't want to live in California, move to Texas or Florida. And same thing with New York. If you don't want to live to New York, move to Florida. And we've seen huge changes of populations. Set the issues aside, those reflect issues. People are running away from the high taxes in California. They're running away from the bad government in Florida. They're running away from the defund the police policies in New York, and they're coming to other places. So at that level, we could say federalism is more important than it has been. The other thing besides that is some of the issues that have come up show this in a particular way. I mean, look at Florida's positions on things like the pandemic, kids going to school, versus the position, say, of Michigan or New York. They're at polar opposites from each other on many of these issues. Law and order is a more stunning case where you have failed to have prosecution of people who have committed crimes in some of the states and tougher policies in other states. So we see, I think, a tightening in many instances of the importance of these laboratories, which I think will continue.
Can I just ask though, so that's a good, you're right. And in fact, like Ron DeSantis, I looked this up recently for a different thing. I had seen that Jeb Bush won Florida's governor's race back when he first ran by 11 points and then 13 points. And then Ron DeSantis just won it by 20 points. And part of what was interesting about Florida is, I think when I was a Kenyan, that was when the Hanging Chads election was, and Florida was a swing state. Florida's not a swing state anymore. Like Florida is a red state. But I guess my question would be like, is that self-sorting good? Like, is that a net good for us as we sort of move more and more in this way of, I don't want to live in places and interact with people who are my political opposites or with whom I don't share sort of complete cultural and political ways of doing things? Is that good for us?
Well, I don't know if it's good for us or bad for us, but it's a human reaction. If you go out on the street and you're worried about your safety, you're not going to hang around if you can move to someplace else. It's a natural human action. If you have a state which is supposed to have a newspapers and claims to have newspapers that present the objective truth, and it turns out that everything that they present is false, then you might move to someplace else. That's the reaction we've been seeing. So I think it's an adjustment to the realities of these different places that have taken place. In Virginia, it's involved the question of education, public education of children. People don't like it, and they haven't yet started to move because they think they can change it here. But if they can change it, there will be people who will be moving from Virginia to other places in the South. So I can't say the health of it, but I can say the reality of it.
George, I did a lot of focus groups in Michigan because it's a swing state. And so I was constantly hearing from people there. And it was actually really interesting. People were kind of mad at Governor Whitmer about COVID. Also, secondarily, they were mostly mad at her about not fixing the roads. Apparently, the roads in Michigan, you guys have some problems that you need to sort out because people were mad about the roads. They had some sense of like personal hypocrisy because she'd like gone to visit some people when things had been shut down, and yet she won by 10 points. And so now that she's sort of won this second term, lots of people are starting to talk about her as a potential 2024 presidential candidate, in part because she has sort of governed and won such a resounding victory in what is a like hinge swing state right now. And it's Midwest, right? So it's the kind of place that people think is more representative broadly of the country. It's like, is Michigan still a swing state? And is Governor Whitmer an interesting person to look at as the future of the Democratic Party?
Oh, I think definitely. I think there's a couple of things that, really make Michigan now more of a swing state than it has been previously in terms of regular voting, right? When it comes to the state level. there was a redistricting commission. Michigan had some of the more gerrymandered state legislative districts in the nation. I know that that's, across the board an issue, but there was an independent group that came together, drew new districts that were seen as more independent, and Democrats actually now control the Senate, small majority, small margin, and the House, small margin there. So, in general, Michigan has been a more Democratic state. They tend to vote for Democrats, in statewide elections more so than for Republicans. And with redistricting, that's now kind of, I think, quantified that in a way that's easier to see and reflective. But it's still really small margins. And if Democrats in Michigan now that they have the majority, I think if they do try to go far left and do it and enact a number of policies that, kind of push people away, then it could go right back to being a Republican controlled legislature. So I think it's very valid to say that the governor is high profile. She has, been high profile for the last couple of years, even since she originally ran for office. And I think people were mad in Michigan, during COVID, because it was a very strong reaction to COVID and lockdowns and kids out of school. But then the governor changed her path, got rid of the head of Health and Human Services at the time, which I think who was really in control of enacting a lot of these policies, replaced him with Director Hertel, Elizabeth Hertel, who did a really wonderful job, and I think saw things in a different way, really helped open things up. And I think at the time, as we came out of it, people said, scary time, beginning of COVID was bad. Yes, maybe it wasn't handled exactly the same way. The governor herself said if she had more information on COVID and knew what she knew now, if she knew then what she knew now, that maybe she would have taken some different approaches. And I think people understood that and appreciated it. And so it's really helped raise her profile. To your earlier question, though, I do want to say too, because I think it was a really good point in what's happening in the states. I don't know that people wake up every day and read what's happening in the political news and say, I'm now going to leave because of X, Y, Z, right? In California, I think people are leaving California because taxes are high. And where are they going? They're going to states like Nevada and they're going to Texas. What's happening in Texas? Texas is becoming a more and more blue state all the time. It's close to purplish now, right? It's still red, but it's becoming purple. So California is going to be a Dem state for a really long time. And as people leave the state of California and move east, a lot into Texas, I think that's going to change the voting dynamics in a state like Texas. And you're going to see a few more Democrats getting elected there. You may start seeing some statewide candidates in Texas that are Democrats getting elected. In Florida, maybe you've seen some migration out of Florida. Maybe those folks are going to Georgia, because now you're starting to see that Georgia's starting to become a battleground state, whereas Florida's going red. Very, very bright red. And so I think people move. It may be for any number of reasons. Financial elements might be a piece of it, other things. What might also drive migration? Again, if you're a female in a state where, if you're in Alabama or Arkansas or Mississippi and you feel like your opportunity, your right to have choice is going to be taken away, you may leave and go to a state where you feel like, okay, if something happens and I needed to get an abortion, I would be able to do so and get us, have safety for my health or for whatever reason I want that. So that might be something that drives migration as well too. But in general, do I think it's because of the politics? Not so much.
Okay, well, you didn't take my bait great on the question of Whitmer for president, but I was using that to transition into like the future part where I just want to ask you both quickly. And I actually am super annoyed. I get asked about 2024 all the time and I'm always annoyed at everybody. I'm like, super early, but they remind me there is already a declared candidate for president, and he is our most recent previous president of the Republican Party. So Trump is already announced, which is super weird and unusual. And it looks like there might be kind of a crowded field of folks who are going to get in on the Republican side. Joe Biden looks like he's running again, despite his advanced age. And let me tell you what, voters have concerns about his advanced age. What do you guys, just give me your quick rundown. Like, what do you think is going to happen in 2024, or even what would you like to see happen?
Well, I think you can say that beneath all this is a dramatic change in the character of the political parties, which is driving this. The Democrats still speak as if they're the party of the common man. I can tell you they're not. They're the party of the people who are wealthier, more educated. Just look at the colleges. They give you a picture of what the Democratic Party is like. The Republican Party, by contrast, has become the party more and more of the common person. and also has gained somewhat among minorities. So the Democrats speak as if they're the party of Franklin Roosevelt. They're the furthest thing from the party of Franklin Roosevelt. They speak as if the wealthy are all members of the Republican Party. It's not true. The wealthy are members of the Democratic Party. So this is what's going on, the major thing going on beneath the surface. And I think it's larger than the particular people that are being mentioned. And as for Trump, yeah, things didn't end well for him. That's for sure. But he was partly, and I think largely, responsible for effectuating this beginning of this change in the American Party and really changing the character of the Republican Party from a different party than it was in the past. And we're going to see the changes that take place and what the consequences will be as we move into the future.
So this is actually a really interesting point, and one that I think is true, that there is a broad coalitional shifting that's going on in the parties. I mean, the Republican Party is, there used to be a term, country club Republican. Republicans were seen as more the elite party when I was younger, and now the Republicans are aggressively trying to brand themselves as a working class party, a multiracial. Sometimes people are surprised, but they are working very hard to brand themselves as a multiracial working class party that rejects sort of when a lot of times people are like, well, what does woke mean? Woke is basically anything that originates on a college campus is how they would describe it. And so they are trying to paint Democrats now as the party of Wall Street, the party of elites. And one of the things that is sort of falling in line with that to some degree is a lot of these swing voters that were decisive in these elections are actually college educated suburban voters who were probably Mitt Romney, John McCain voters. But they're wealthier, and they basically are saying, like, actually, if you give me a moderate Democrat, I'll take that over somebody who's a more populist sort of right-wing Republican. And so that coalitional transformation is having a big impact. But going into 2024, like Joe Biden's, one of the things that helped Joe Biden was that he was able to kind of hold on to some of those working class voters that the Democrats had been shedding. But do you think that the Republicans are going to sort of nominate, do you think that Ron DeSantis is the future and that's the kind of sort of populist fighter, that's the direction of the future of the party? Or do you think that people are still going to want to go to the OG for Trump? This is to Jim really quickly.
I say DeSantis would be the preferable choice, and that maybe we're seeing a situation in which Trump is losing. I wouldn't hazard a guess on this, but that would be my feeling, that his prowess should decline somewhat. But that's just a guess.
Okay, last question to George really quickly. Yes or no? Should Biden run again?
I think yes. I think, when you look at President Biden's accomplishments, whatever you want to say about the war in Afghanistan, it was a long war. We were in it for way too long. There's nobody who's ever done well in the war in Afghanistan, and we got out of that war. He brought us out of the pandemic. That was hard. It was painful, but we got out of it. He's seen massive changes to American social safety net, major infrastructure funding bill. That's a big thing. Clean energy manufacturing. I think people may want to say that that's a leftist policy, but I think people are really going to have to start looking at the environment. And it's not going to be a liberal concept, right? Like the ability to go, I live in Michigan, there is a lake every 2 miles. I cannot go to a lake in Michigan, throw in a line and catch a fish and eat that fish in an inland lake because it's so polluted anywhere in the state of Michigan. And that's everywhere in this country. Clean water isn't a liberal policy. It's not an anti-conservative thing. It's something that we need. Clean air, all of these different things. They're not liberal policies, but I think it's being painted as a liberal policy, but it's something that we really have to look at. But he's seen, major things there, drops in prescription drug prices, student loan forgiveness, yay, right? Like a big deal. So I think President Biden has done well. If he was to run again, it's an advanced age, but I'm not going to say that somebody should be disqualified for anything because of how old they are. If he can do the job, I think that's perfectly fine. There will be other candidates that are out there. But also, I do want to say this, Jim said Trump maybe is the biggest change factor in the Republican Party. I don't think that's the case. I think the biggest historical change factor in today's Republican Party was Newt Gingrich with the Contract of America. I think that begat the Tea Party. I think the Tea Party begat MAGA. And I think that that's where we are now. And what's probably going to happen, like a bad movie, Trump has been the face of this massive change. in the Republican Party, but I think there's going to be somebody that's going to try to out-Trump Trump. And then that person may end up getting notoriety. The fact that Matt Gaetz has become the voice of a specific on the national scene, and I find that to be disgusting because he's not a good person, I don't think, from all the reports that are out there. He's this person who's now becoming a major figure and mouthpiece in the Republican Party. That's problematic. And so you may end up seeing somebody like that. It might be DeSantis. I would love to see, somebody like Kinzinger from Illinois or even Liz Cheney become major figures and become the real voices of the Republican Party and bring it back to moderation and help make a stronger party. I don't know that that's going to be the case.
Don't hold your breath for that, because I've asked voters that a lot, and it's not a big lane there for those guys. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Joe because I've taken over. I've gone 7 minutes over my allotted time, which I apologize for. You're on with questions.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you both Jim and George, and we'll see if we can throw a few more questions at you. One of the kinds of questions that have come up, more than one of the audience members have asked it, has to do with the extent to which it seems that there are small groups on the extremes that are sort of driving politics today, and that in the vast middle, there is, in some senses, not representation, which causes some people to ask, do we need a third party? And at least one other question arose about whether ranked choice voting, which we've seen introduced in some places in the United States, might be a way to get a return to some more moderate politics. And so I'll first ask what you think about the prospects for either any kind of a third party emerging, or some tinkering with electoral rules, possibly moving us back to the center, or are we stuck with people being primaried on both sides?
George, go ahead.
I'll jump in first and just say, if I was to prognosticate what's going to happen in the next presidential, I think Trump loses to somebody like DeSantis. I don't think he takes it well. I think he Ross Perot's it and runs as an independent, and I think it costs the Republican candidate the presidency. That's what I will, take my crystal ball out, and that's what I think is going to happen. In general, though, I would love to see good third party candidates and a strong third party. I'd love to see a good fourth party or a good fifth party. I think it would be great if you had interest groups who were able to come together and be able to have solid platforms that they really truly believed in, that didn't have to be mixes and all that good stuff, and then work with other parties to make moderate policies that are best for everybody. I don't know that we can do that now because there's too much money to be made, and it's already in there. Like, we're stuck in the two-party system. There are too many people that are making tons of money. How much it costs to run an election now is stupid. Like, the amount of money you have the constitutional right to go vote for elected officials. Why does that now also require me to write checks to get people to do that? Why do corporations have to do that? Why do corporations have such a strong influence in how that goes, where all those dollars are coming from, et cetera, et cetera? There are a lot of people with a vested interest to make sure that things stay the way they are. And I think that's going to be an uphill battle for everybody to fight in order to make that change.
Okay.
Third parties are bad. Ranked choice voting is not going to save you. It's not going to happen across the country. And the best bet is to use the political parties to force in-group moderation through elections, by electoral defeats, by beating extremists over and over again until the parties force themselves back in the middle. Short. Sorry.
Oh, great. Thank you. Jim, did you have anything you wanted to add on that?
No,
one?
I liked her comments.
Okay. Sort of on the theme of where there are moderates, one question came through asking what the real character of the so-called moderates in the Republican caucus in the House is there much of a moderate caucus, and how will they likely operate?
Well, it depends. This objection of a very small group of Republicans was to the moderates in the Republican Party, or so they said. I don't know if I'd call them moderates. I'd call them conservatives, but not quite as far conservative as some of these other people. But the speaker, the minority leader now in the Senate. I think he represents a good picture of a somewhat moderate Republican, but nevertheless conservative in character. And many of those who follow him are in that same camp. So I think that gives a good idea of where the Republican Party stands. The people that have been identified as MAGA, I don't know where MAGA begins and MAGA ends. I know some MAGA people, but I wouldn't say that everyone in the Republican caucus in the voting in the House was a MAGA. They were a small amount, if you count them. Up only 10% or so of the Republican Party was in that group.
Yeah, I would say the bulk of elected officials in general are just people who woke up one day and decided they wanted to help people. And they've been doing it since they were dog catchers, since they were, helping out in schools, they were school board, whatever else. And they get elected to state legislators and they get elected to federal bodies. And they really just want to help people. And that's the bulk of them. Those aren't the ones that get on TV. They're not the ones that get the most notoriety, but the people who are just going to work every day and really fighting hard to do the people's business. And so I think that's the bulk of folks. They're quiet, they put their nose to the grindstone and do what they're going to do. And I think that body of people is still there. I think that's sizable. And I think that, again, people oftentimes want to say today's crazy and everything's bad. It's not. When you look at historically, I think every year we exist, we get a little bit better as a people. And I think the people that help get us there and help run this country are a big part of that.
One of our viewers noted that there seemed to have been some pretty big negatives in the kind of situation leading up to the election, particularly inflation, high gas prices, the inability to get a policy about refugees and other immigrants at the border that would solve what seems to be a kind of chaotic situation. And it's not clear that did that much damage. Do you have a view about how much particularly the economic situation, the negatives in the economic situation actually shaped this past election, or did we all get excited about it because of what some have said in the past, and it really didn't have that much impact?
Me?
What do you think, Jim?
I mean, it didn't have as much impact as many expected that it would, given the size of the amount of the inflation and whatnot. So I think that would be the case. I still say that underneath this, though, you look at American politics, not just in terms of this last election, but in terms of the future, that the real issues go much deeper than the contemporary problems of inflation. They have to do with the direction of the country. And I see this from from a university campus, maybe not what's happening at Kenyon, but what's happening at the major universities. The major universities are overwhelmingly on the left. There's no doubt about it. There are very few conservative professors at the best colleges and universities. They're just not there. They're not heard. If they speak, they're shut down. This is the reality. If the country moves in the direction of these people, you're going to have this clash, you could call it, of the highly educated, linked with major elements of the media who no longer practice journalism, but practice a strange form of merely doing what the left wants them to do, keeping news away from them that's unfamiliar to the people on the right, versus a lot of the people that you spoke of, the average person in the middle who doesn't have the means, I'm talking about the intellectual means, to be able to combat this monopoly of influence that's controlling so much of our culture and has so much power over so much of our culture. It can vote when it sees what's clear, but it really has lacked the means. And we'll see if the Republican Party can successfully become the party which begins to be able to articulate in a decent way this point of view in the nation. I think that's what's going to happen in the future, and we'll see the two sides in a struggle against each other. And I think Ron DeSantis would be an excellent candidate to articulate that, I'll call it conservative Republican position, but not a radical conservative position.
Yeah, I think economy is always front of mind. Is the economy stupid? It's always a thing. It will always be a thing. People are always concerned about their pocketbooks. But I think, there's this weird thing what happened this year, why it didn't have more influence. Part of it may be that you're seeing raising inflation, but part of that inflation was because people were seeing raises in the minimum wage as well in a lot of different places. And so, yeah, that's going to result in the cost of goods going up, but it's also going to result in more people having more money in their pocket. I'm one of those people that thinks that minimum wage should be tied to inflation. I think that makes perfect sense because you were seeing people's wages drop significantly compared to the price of goods and services. So did that help increase costs? Potentially. Gas prices. Surprisingly, it seems like, especially in the years where there are Democrats who were in office, the cost of gas always tends to rise somewhere around July, August. And then all of a sudden, a couple of months later, something happens and the cost of gas goes down. We were getting $2 something a gallon gas here in Michigan, over the course of the last couple of weeks, a surprising drop. And there's tons of reasons why that happened. But seemingly every year when Democrats are in power, gas prices go up and all of a sudden public safety is a big thing. And then when they're not, all of a sudden it's not. So I think that there are lots of reasons why a lot of these issues are at play, but I think the economic issues are always going to be important. But the question is, for what reason? Are people seeing more money in their pockets? Are people seeing an increase in the cost of gas, especially? The cost of housing is starting to go down, maybe not for the best reasons because interest rates are going up a little bit, and I think that's going to cause housing to go down. But the cost of housing has risen in an unbelievably drastic fashion that's almost untenable. And so hopefully we'll see a lot of those things get better for American consumers.
Looks like we only have a couple minutes left. Sarah, we've made you be the moderator all this time, and I wonder if you have any reflections on where we stand right now before we close things out.
Yeah, I'll just answer this last question very quickly, which is that I listen to voters. They feel real economic pain and pain, and frustration with supply chains. The idea that just America wasn't working as well. They did. I heard it all the time. It was real. That being said, the Republicans decided to run a bunch of election deniers, like Carrie Lake and Blake Masters, and people who ran the swing voters had just rejected Trump in 2020. And so and they ran a test case. Glenn Youngkin forced a 12-point swing by running as a normal person in Virginia, in a state that is more democratic, right? And so they have that issue, they have it right there. Oh, run somebody like this and we could do really well this year. And they basically ignored that lesson. They ran Carrie Lake and Blake Masters and Dr. Oz, who, it doesn't even matter if he's extreme, he's a super weird candidate. Doug Mastriano, one of the most extreme candidates I've ever seen, got crushed by Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania by about 14 points because he's a lunatic. Republicans nominated election denying lunatics, and the party, I think that and I'll just say to the speaker's race very quickly, the frame of the moderates or the governing wing versus the chaos wing of the 20, Marjorie Taylor Greene is not part of the governing party. She is not part of the moderates. She is also a crazy person, election denier, QAnon person, Jewish space lasers, anti-Semite. She was Kevin McCarthy's big get. It is the Republican Party has moved to an incredibly extreme place in terms of what it projects, and the fact that it doesn't adhere. That there was a coup attempt. That's a real problem. It's a real bad thing. The Republican Party can't even comment right now on the fact that there has been a coup. There's been an attack on an election in Brazil because Republicans don't have anything to say about that because they also committed that violence against the electoral process and democracy. So Republicans are going to have to figure themselves out here because they're in a really bad place. And I think that Democrats, where they ran normal candidates against these crazy people, were able to be successful in a year where the fundamentals were all against them. And that should be their lesson. And if Democrats do the same thing that Republicans do and don't take that lesson and instead go nominate a bunch more far left, economically progressive people who are going to run on wokester stuff, they're going to lose. So everybody should, all things in moderation applies to all things. and should apply to politics too. That's my thanks for letting me say something right at the end of moderating.
You bet. Thank you all. Thanks everybody for joining us this evening. I can say I'm sure we're going to have a very exciting couple of years politically. We hope we can do something like this again in our Hill to Hill series. Thanks especially to Sarah, Jim, and George for being willing to come on and share your views and help us analyze this difficult situation. Have a great 2023, everyone. We hope to see you in Gambier when you can, and otherwise wherever. With that, we'll say good night.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye, guys.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Bye.